Hey everybody, Dylan with ON1 here, and in this video, I want to give you guys some tips on how to capture and how to edit waterfall photos. And I know there's probably 1,000 different tips on this exact same subject, but I can't make this video 3 hours long, so for the sake of this video, I just want to give you guys sort of a nice baseline of tips that I've learned along the way when shooting and editing waterfall photos. So the first tip I want to give you guys is maybe some gear recommendations. And the first thing I would recommend when shooting waterfall photos is to definitely get a tripod. It's not essential that you have a tripod because you can always just set your camera down to keep your camera steady when you're shooting, but a tripod makes it easier to use different locations for your camera, and also you can raise them up and down to get different angles and perspectives. Tripods also allow you to keep your camera steady when shooting at longer exposures. Sometimes when shooting waterfalls, you want to use a long exposure to get some motion in the water. Well, to achieve that without any shake and to keep everything in focus, use a tripod and it'll keep your camera steady the entire time. The next thing I would recommend getting would be a polarizing filter or an ND filter. What these filters do is they allow you to control light better. Basically, if you have a bright scene for a waterfall and you want to use long exposure on it, you can stick this filter on the end of your lens and it'll allow you to use long exposure for a bright scene. This will give you that soft look on the water when you shoot with long exposure. And the last thing I would recommend getting if you're trying to shoot waterfalls in the future is to get a blower for your camera. They help out when little water speckles get onto your lens and you can easily blow them off so that you don't have any flare or glares when you're shooting your photos. Those are just a few basic things I would recommend when going out and shooting waterfall photos, but they aren't essential to getting an awesome waterfall shot, and you can still have a great time without any of those. So if you don't have a tripod, I would recommend just trying to find a dry, level spot to place your camera. The filter thing would be a tough one because they actually screw on to the end of your lens. If you don't have a filter, maybe try going out to shoot on an overcast day where the light's a little bit more controlled and it's less bright. But if all else fails and you don't have a tripod or a lens filter or a blower for your camera, I would just recommend going out and shooting some waterfalls and having a good time. Because the best way to learn about what gear you actually need is just to go out and start taking photos. You'll start to learn what gear you would need for the type of shots you're looking for, and then you can buy the right gear for your type of photography. The next tip I want to give you guys is to think about composition when you're shooting your waterfall photos. And by composition, I mean to think about leading lines, how you want your subject composed, how your framing is, your vantage points, your angles, all of the different basic elements that go into a nice photograph. And I actually took this photo as a reference point so that I could show you all of the different ways to compose one single waterfall. So you'll notice that I have these different logs in my photo that I could use as leading lines. I have this nice waterfall here, and I have these different rocks that I can use for framing. So now I'm going to show you guys a few different ways that I compose the scene using different elements around my waterfall to help me out when it came to composition. So for this shot, you'll notice that I actually just set my camera near the rock and the log here, around this area right here, so that I could use this log as a leading line. And if I cropped right here, I could use this left side as a nice frame for my waterfall shot here. For this shot, I actually just set my camera on this log that was halfway in the water and halfway on the bank so that I could use these rocks here as leading lines into the waterfall area. And then I have nice little areas to frame with this rock here and these logs. So if I go back to that original shot, you'll see that there's those rocks right there, and I had this little log there that I just set my camera on and pointed it at the waterfall. For this photo, I actually just set my camera on top of the rock here to the left. I just set it on top of that part area right there. And that allowed me to use this log as a leading line into my subject area here. And if I cropped, I could use these trees as a nice little frame, and my subject would be composed in an interesting way for the viewer. The next tip I want to share with you guys is to play with exposure when you're shooting your waterfalls. Whenever I typically go out to shoot waterfalls, I like to shoot a few long exposure shots so that I can get sort of that nice motion in the water, but I also like to freeze the frame a little bit with higher shutter speeds. So you'll notice that with this photo, I shot it with a longer exposure. The shutter speed I shot it with was about 2 seconds at f22. Well, I shot the same waterfall with a faster shutter speed, and you'll notice that it sort of gave it a different look. It's almost like it's a heavier feeling photo because it kind of feels like all of this is frozen, whereas this is sort of more of an elegant shot because it has this nice motion in the water here, and it seems more of like an artsy creative shot, whereas this one sort of feels like a more raw, powerful photo to me. Well, I'm a huge fan of actually just freezing the frame when I shoot waterfalls, especially if I have something in the foreground that I'm using for my subject and I'm using a waterfall for the background. So I'll go through a few photos here where I've shot the waterfall with a faster shutter speed. This photo I shot with a faster shutter speed. I shot it at 1/4000th of a second at 2.8, used my buddy here as the subject, and it worked nicely as a nice little background for my photo. For this shot, I just distanced myself from the waterfall, used a really fast shutter speed, the same as was before, and just sort of captured this waterfall frozen in time, but just from a different vantage point. So what I recommend doing when it comes to using exposure is to maybe try for both and see how you like them, especially when you're starting out, so that you can kind of see the sort of shots that you want to take when you're shooting waterfalls. So those were just a few tips and then maybe a couple gear recommendations that would help when capturing waterfall photos. But now on to the creative part of the waterfall photo process, and that is the editing part. So the next part of the video, I want to show you guys how you can creatively process your waterfall photos using ON1 Photo RAW. So for the next couple tips, I just want to show you guys a few different examples of how you would deal with the basic tonality of a waterfall shot. I guess one of the basic things that I would probably think about when editing a waterfall shot is to think about your highlights and your exposure. Because the main subject of your shot is going to be a waterfall most of the time, it's going to be a lot of white because it's going to be water. Especially if you have long exposure, it's going to be even brighter. So I would deal with exposure by holding down your J key, and by holding down your J key, you're going to see your true white in your shot. So I see that there's some true white in my shot here, so I'm just going to pull back on my exposure. And then to deal with all of the shadowy areas in your photo, just pull up on the shadow slider, and it'll bring back a bunch of shadow detail without overexposing that area. But if I did it the opposite way, so if I reset this and I just brought up my exposure, you'll notice that it'll overexpose the waterfall and this area. So now if I hold down my J key, now I have blown out areas in my waterfall and in the sky here. So what I would recommend is just pay attention to your true white, hold down your J key and see whatever areas in your photo you have blown out. It's pretty easy to pull back on the exposure slider and then pull up on the shadow slider to reveal the darker areas in your photo. So unlike the last photo, this shot was taken with a little bit longer of exposure, and you can tell by sort of the motion in the water flowing down. When it comes to longer exposure on waterfalls, they typically tend to have brighter water. So if you hold down your J key, I can see that I have a bunch of true white in my waterfall here. So I'll just do the same thing, and I'll pull back on the exposure to remove it. And once I have all of that true white removed, I'm just going to pull up on my shadow slider a little bit, just to sort of reveal some of the darker areas in my shot. And now that we sort of have a really basic tonality for our photo, I'm going to show you guys a little bit of tools and tricks that I would use whenever I'm editing inside of Develop. So this is whenever I'm setting the basic tone for a shot. Well, for this photo, it seems a little bit green to me, so I'm actually just going to cool it down a little bit. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull back on the saturation because it kind of feels like all of these greens are distracting. And now what I want to do is I just want to bring some contrast into my photo. So I'm actually just going to go up to contrast and I'm going to boost it a little bit. And you'll notice that that sort of subdued this area around my waterfall and really brought the viewer's eye into the waterfall itself. And another thing I like to do inside of Develop is I actually like to retouch. So if there's anything on my photo that I need to retouch, such as these little sort of speckles of light on here, I actually didn't have a lens filter for my camera and I didn't have a blower to use to blow off the lens. So I had a little bit of mist on there and it created these little speckles. Well, an easy way to get rid of those is just simply head over to your retouch tools here. And I like to just grab my perfect eraser and you can just hover over it, click on it, and it'll instantly take it away. So if you do have anything like that, if you end up shooting and there's a bright sun and it's sort of glaring into your photo, you can use the perfect eraser or the retouch brush to easily remove any of those distractions from your photo. So for this last shot here, I want to show you guys how I would set the overall tonality for it using Develop. And then I want to show you guys all of the different filters that I use whenever I'm editing waterfall photos inside of Effects. So let's get started here. And the first thing I'm going to do again is I'm going to hold down my J key. And it's going to show me my true white. And I can see that there's a few blown out spots in my little waterfall here. So we'll just pull back on the exposure. And then I'm just going to go down and I'm going to pull up on my shadows a little bit to bring back some of that darker detail in my shot. And now what I want to do, since I sort of remove the contrast here by downing the exposure and upping the shadows, is I can go down and I'm going to hold down my J key again. And I'm just going to pull back on my black slider to reveal some true black in my shot. That's the blue right here, is all of the true black without any detail. So let's add some of that in there to bring in some contrast. And I actually want a little bit more contrast, so I can just head up to the contrast slider here and I'll pull up on it. And now we have a little bit more contrast in our photo, and it's sort of revealed this area in our shot more and kind of made it the point to be the subject. So now what I want to do is I'm actually just going to head down and I'm going to cool off the shot a little bit. Right about there. And I'm just actually going to pull down on the saturation again, just to take out some of those bright colors of the greens in my shot. So now that we've sort of set the basic tone and color for our photo, I'm actually just going to head over to crop. And I've been kind of addicted to shooting 4x5s, so I'm going to crop it at 4x5. Just get a nice little crop in here. There we go. So now that we've set the overall tonality for our photo and cropped it, I'm just going to hit the backslash key on my keyboard here. And you'll see that we didn't do a ton to our shot, but we did remove some of that bright area in our waterfall, and then we revealed some of the darker areas in our photo. We can always go back and re-edit any of these adjustments, but for now I want to show you guys a few of my favorite filters to use when editing waterfall photos inside of Effects. So if we take our photo and we head into Effects, the first filter that I generally always use whenever I put a filter onto a waterfall shot is Sunshine. And the Sunshine filter just really brightens up that water and sort of subdues everything around it. Whenever you're adding a Sunshine filter, keep in mind that the Sunshine filter is going to brighten all the brighter areas in your shot, and it's going to darken all the darker areas in your shot. So if your water is already blown out or it's overexposed, I would recommend not using Sunshine, or if you do, sort of play with the opacity and the amount to get it the way you want it. But you'll notice that if I turn this on and off, it really brightened up that water for us and then sort of subdued the area around it and really brought the viewer's eye into the waterfall area. Another one of my favorite filters to use when editing waterfall photos is to use the glow filter. So if I add a glow filter here, you'll see that it's not doing too much to my shot. Well, I usually just like to click this darker, especially if I'm putting on to water, because it kind of acts like a polarizer in a way and really makes the water stand out. So now what I want to do is I'm going to head into my masking options and I'm going to invert this mask. And now I'm going to make sure that my masking brush is selected and it's set to paint in. And now I'm just going to paint this nice glow filter onto my water here. And now if I turn that on and off, you'll see that it kind of acts like a polarizer and really sort of adds this nice glow filter to the water and softens it up, but kind of brings it to life at the same time. So there's only a couple more filters that I generally use when I'm shooting waterfalls, and another one of those filters would have to be the color enhancer filter. So I'm going to add the color enhancer filter on here, and I really like to add the color enhancer filter when I'm working with waterfalls because it allows me to control each specific color within that shot. So if I want to deal with the blues or I want to deal with the greens specifically, I can do that all within Color Enhancer. So for this shot, I know there's actually a lot of foliage around, so I'm just going to use the preset style here. And you'll see that that sort of boosted the greens in my shot. But there's this sort of blue tint, purple tint over my water. So I'm actually just going to head over to Add Filter again. and I'm going to add another color enhancer. And what I want to do is I just want to take this sort of blue cast off of the water. So I'm actually just going to heat this up quite a bit and kind of pull back on the saturation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my purity for my highlights, and I'm just going to turn that up to about, I don't know, 30 to 40. And what that's going to do is it's going to remove any saturation from my highlights, like in this water here. So now I'm going to do the same thing I did before, and I'm going to go to my masking options. I'm going to invert my mask, and now I'm simply just going to paint that color enhancer onto my water there. So if I turn it on and off, you'll see that it sort of brightened up my highlights and sort of removed that blue cast from the waterfall. And for my last go-to filter, whenever I'm editing waterfall shots, would have to be a vignette. And so I'm going to go down to add filter, and I'm going to add a vignette. And my favorite, hands down, has to be the preset Big Softy. And what I really like to do when adding a vignette is I'm just going to go down to the centering tool here, and I'm just going to drag it over to, the subject part of my waterfall. And now if I turn that on and off, you'll see that it's done a really great job of sort of subduing the corners around my photo and really bringing the viewer's eye into the waterfall area. So I'm going to hit the backslash key on my keyboard to see my original shot. And so what we've done here is we've sort of set a basic tonality inside of develop, and then we've taken our photo to effects and added some different filters on it to really make our waterfall come to life. I'm Dylan with ON1. Thank you so much for watching this video. Stay tuned for more, and have a great weekend.